Welcome back to Midnight Outcry, everyone, and good evening. Tonight we're going north of the border into Canada's hidden corners, where small towns are home to darkness that would cause even the most courageous people to doubt humanity, and solitude nurtures secrets. From the vast Canadian wilderness, 7 stories await us. More unsettling than the prior one, they were all drawn from the shadows of far-flung communities, where sins go unpunished for decades and cries go unheard. We will discover tales from British Columbia's coastal villages to Ontario's mining communities that demonstrate that, on occasion, the most dreadful creatures are not otherworldly creatures hiding in the woods, but rather the neighbors. These are true stories from actual people who had experiences that profoundly altered their perception of evil itself. They are not just urban legends or campfire tales that have been passed down through the ages. Get daily real horror stuff that will keep you up at night by subscribing to Midnight Outcry if you're new here. To ensure that you never miss the call of darkness, press that notification bell. Let's now enter the Canadian wilderness's shadows, where civilization stops and terror commences. I'm Detective Kendrick Walsh, and I believe I've seen it all in my 15 years of investigating small-town crimes around northern Ontario. Logging camps and domestic conflicts, violent bar fights, and missing people who disappeared into the forest and never came back. However, that was all prior to the icy January of 2022, when the Jalen Morrison case reached my desk. In addition to altering my perspective on human trafficking, what I learned throughout that research also altered my understanding of how these predators function in the most isolated regions, where no one is looking and no one is asking questions. When the call came in, I had been stationed in Timmins for 3 years. The temperature outdoors was roughly minus 35 degrees Celsius on a Tuesday morning, the kind of cold that the air itself hurts your lungs. Martha Henley, the proprietor of Henley's All-Light Diner, a greasy spoon eatery that catered to truckers and mine workers around the clock, made the call. On the phone, Martha was in a panic. She reiterated that throughout the 2 years she had been employed there, Jalen had never skipped a shift. The previous year, Jalen Morrison, a 19-year-old local girl, had graduated from Gorman High School. She had been saving money from her job as a waitress to go to nursing school in Sudbury, and she lived with her grandmother in a modest home on the outskirts of town. According to everyone, she was trustworthy, accountable, and had her entire future planned out. That Monday, she was scheduled to start working the nighttime shift at 11:00 p.m. until 7 in the morning, but she never arrived. Martha was pacing behind the bar, trembling as she poured coffee for the few patrons who had drifted in for breakfast when I got to the diner. Running that cafe for more than 20 years, she was a woman in her 60s who was familiar with every frequent customer's and employee's routines like clockwork. Jalen had done her regular Sunday night shift without any issues, according to Martha. She had appeared normal, perhaps a little worn out, but nothing unusual. Her clock-out time was 7:00 a.m. As usual, she bid farewell and left through the front door on Monday morning. Nobody saw her again after that. Jalen's grandma lived in a tiny bungalow with peeling paint and a snow-covered garden that had not been cared for in years. I drove directly there. Jalen had been reared by Eleanor Morrison, who was 82 since she was 7 years old. Eleanor was sitting in her living room, wrapped in a heavy blanket, holding a cup of tea in her shaking hands after Jalen's mother had perished in a traffic accident. When I knocked, she informed me that Jalen had returned home from work on Monday, had eaten breakfast, and had gone to bed at approximately 9:00 in the morning, as she always did after her night shift. Around 6:00 p.m. on Monday, Eleanor had awakened up and had anticipated seeing Jalen preparing for work. However, Jalen's work clothes was still hanging in the closet, and her bed was unoccupied. Her winter coat, boots, and handbag were gone, but everything else was just as she had left it. She still had her phone charger plugged into the socket next to her bed. A partially completed nursing school application was still visible on the screen of her laptop, which was open on her desk. Over the course of the following 2 days, I interviewed everyone who might have seen Jalen and walked throughout the area. No one had seen her leave the house Monday night, but as Timmins is a small village, news spreads quickly when someone goes missing. No one had noticed her strolling around the streets. It seemed as though she had just disappeared. I made the decision to watch the diner's security footage on Thursday morning. Martha had added that following a string of break-ins at local businesses, they had recently installed a new camera system. The restaurant's interior, front entrance, and parking lot were all captured by the cameras. I watched Jalen serve clients, clear tables, and go about her daily business for hours as I went through the tape from Sunday night and Monday morning. However, the video from Monday night was the pivotal moment. 8:47 p.m. The surveillance camera captured Jalen entering the cafe through the front door on Monday night, over 12 hours after she was meant to have gone home and gone to bed. Her job uniform was not on her. Rather, she wore a bulky winter coat and jeans, and she appeared anxious, looking over her shoulder all the while. She spoke with Martha for around 2 minutes after approaching the counter where she was working. Then she headed back toward the entryway after turning around. However, she wasn't by herself. One of the booths in the corner had been occupied by a man who was partially hidden by shadows. He got up and followed her to the entrance. He had brown hair, a beard, and was tall, most likely in his 40s. He was dressed in work boots and a bulky winter jacket, fitting in well with the truckers and construction workers who often visited the diner. In the video, he was seen walking outdoors with Jalen and putting his hand on his back. I called Martha right away to inquire about the visit on Monday night. She claimed that Jalen had not been scheduled to work that evening and had not arrived, first giving the impression that she was perplexed. However, her voice grew cautious when I asked her about it. She finally acknowledged that she had appeared upset about something when Jalen had arrived at around 8:30 p.m. Jalen needed to call someone and her cell phone was dead, so she had asked if she may use the phone. Jalen thanked her and walked out when Martha allowed her to use the phone behind the counter. Something in Martha's voice suggested me she wasn't being completely honest when she said she hadn't observed the man who followed Jalen out. In an attempt to find out where Jalen and the unidentified man had gone, I downloaded the surveillance footage from a number of establishments along the main route that leads out of town. I was able to figure together their itinerary, even though the majority of the cameras were outdated and the video was poor. 2 streets from the cafe, they had strolled to a dark-colored pickup truck parked behind the Tim Hortons. The truck was a common make and model that could have belonged to any of the hundreds of persons in the neighborhood, and none of the films showed the license plate. The trail stopped at that point. In order to get help with what was now obviously a possible abduction case, I called the Ontario Provincial Police. 2 days later, Detective Sarah Chen from the OP's Human Trafficking Squad came in Timmins, bringing with her an alternative theory regarding Jalen Morrison's possible fate. Detective Chen clarified that because of its isolated location and migratory population, Northern Ontario had turned into a conduit for human trafficking operations. Workers from all over the nation were brought in by mining firms, logging activities, and trucking routes. Many of them had no family ties to the area and no permanent address. It was the ideal setting for illegal activity, without drawing the notice of police authorities. She informed me that local businesses were frequently utilized as fronts for trafficking rings. Convenient meeting locations, including as restaurants, motels, and truck stops, allowed victims to be moved between handlers without raising suspicions. Before acting, the criminals would frequently spend weeks or months getting to know possible victims and earning their trust. We went back to the diner and asked Martha additional questions. Detective Chen took the initiative this time and was more straightforward in her approach. "We think Jalen has been trafficked," she told Martha, "and anyone who assisted in the crime could be charged with a terrible felony." She added that if Martha had seen something that would have identified the criminals, she might have been in danger herself. Martha finally broke down and told us the truth at that point. Jalen was not unfamiliar with the man who had followed him out of the diner. He was named Rick Dalton, and he had been frequenting the diner for almost half a year. He stated that he traveled between construction sites around Northern Ontario as part of his job. He consistently left substantial tips and was kind and helpful. Over time, he had begun to speak with Jalen, inquiring about her aspirations for nursing school and offered to cover her tuition. According to Martha, Rick had informed Jalen that he knew individuals who could help her land a far higher paying position as a hostess at upscale restaurants in Toronto and Montreal. which would be far more lucrative than waitressing. Compared to working at the diner, the job would pay enough for her to save money for school far more quickly. He had instructed her to call him if she was interested and had given her his phone number. Jalen was furious when she arrived at the diner on Monday night because she had contacted Rick, but her grandmother's phone was broken. She had agreed to take his job offer, and she had to call him back on the diner's phone. That evening, she was to meet him to go over the specifics. Martha claimed that although she didn't want to get involved in Jalen's choices, she got a nasty feeling about the entire affair. She was young and ready to change her situation, and Martha knew that there weren't many good-paying jobs in Timmins. With Rick Dalton's identity in hand, Detective Chen gained access to databases that I was not authorized to use. We found out that Rick Dalton was a phony within a few hours. Richard Delkowski, the man's real name, has been detained twice in Manitoba on suspicion of human trafficking. He knew acquaintances in British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec who were suspected of being involved in trafficking operations, but both cases had been dropped for lack of evidence. More significantly, cell phone records traced by Detective Chen's connections revealed Rick had been in frequent touch with multiple numbers linked to residences in Toronto and Montreal. His phone pattern indicated that he was reporting on possible victims, setting up transfers, and communicating with other trafficking network members. Time was of the essence, but we now had sufficient evidence to secure search warrants and launch a coordinated operation with law enforcement agencies across many provinces. According to Detective Chen, victims of human trafficking are typically relocated often and swiftly in order to keep them from making friends or discovering enough information about their whereabouts to flee. Unexpectedly, the breakthrough was made. Through one of Rick's phone numbers, we were able to locate a Sudbury-based trucking company suspected of moving victims of human trafficking between places in northern Ontario and southern Ontario along Highway 11. OP police discovered thorough logs of routes, pickup locations, and drop-off places when they carried out a search warrant on the company's premises. An abandoned mine, 30 kilometers outside of Timmins, was one of the sites. The underground tubes were still in place, even though the mine had been shuttered for more than 10 years. Detective Chen believed that traffickers may have discovered a means to enter the underground spaces, where victims could be detained without any chance of being seen or heard, even though local officials had sealed off the majority of the entrances years prior. A combined task force consisting of OP police, RCMP officers, and local emergency responders arrived at the abandoned mining site on a Friday morning, precisely 2 weeks after Jalen had originally vanished. They carried thermal imaging equipment that could detect the heat of the human body through concrete and rock, as well as specialized equipment for subterranean rescue operations. They finally located her after almost 6 hours of searching. Deep beneath, in a makeshift holding facility, Jalen was alive, but hardly conscious. She had hypothermia, malnourishment, and dehydration. She was breathing, though. In what had been an equipment storage area, she had been shackled to a support beam. There was proof that other people had recently been detained in the same place. Her health was rapidly stabilized by the paramedics before she was sent to the Timmins Hospital. Doctors weren't sure she would live for the first 48 hours. However, when John Morrison was able to speak at last, no one recognized how strong she was. She informed us that Rick had taken her to a restaurant in Sudbury for what he said was a job interview. However, he had taken her to a remote home where 3 other guys were waiting, rather than stopping at a restaurant. She was in the underground room at the mine site when she woke up after being drugged. She had been informed that she would be sent to Toronto, where she would be compelled to engage in prostitution until she settled a debt they said she owed for lodging, board, and transportation expenses. Because the loan was intended to be unrepayable, she would be stuck there forever. After being taken into custody, Rick and 2 of his colleagues were accused of conspiracy, forcible detention, and human trafficking. According to the inquiry, they had been targeting young women from small communities who were trying to improve their financial circumstances for at least 2 years in Northern Ontario. We found out throughout the trial that they had more victims besides Jalen. At least 12 other young women from areas in Northern Ontario and Manitoba have been successfully trafficked by the network. The vast majority of the victims were never located. Although Jalen Morrison's physical injuries have healed, she will always carry the psychological scars from the incident. Her plans to go to nursing school were never fulfilled. Although she survived and her case gave law enforcement agencies across Canada a better understanding of how these trafficking networks function in isolated communities, the lost trust could never be totally restored. Regarding Rick Dalton, also known as Richard Dalkowski, he was found guilty and given an 18-year sentence in federal prison. However, I was cautioned by Detective Chen that trafficking networks are similar to hydras. One head is severed, and two more seem to replace it. The need for victims guarantees that predators will always be willing to prey on the weak, particularly in remote areas where they may work covertly. I learned from the Jalen Morrison case that evil does not always appear as we may anticipate. Sometimes it appears to be a kind client who asks courteous inquiries about your future aspirations and gives generous gratuities. At times, it presents chances that look too good to be true while sporting a helping smile. And occasionally it works right in front of us, waiting for the ideal opportunity to strike in the locations where we should feel the safest. As a third-generation farmer named Dalen Kowalski, what transpired on our property in the winter of 2019 caused me to reevaluate all of my preconceived notions about the land. And my family has 60 years of professional experience. This 800-acre property in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, was purchased by my grandfather in 1959, when the oil boom was just getting started and land was still inexpensive. In the 1980s, my father grew the business, and I believed I knew every hill, creek, and tree stand on the land better than I knew my own reflection when I acquired it in 2015. I was mistaken. Late November, just after the season's first significant snowfall, was the first indication that something was amiss. As I often did in the winter, I had been out early that morning to see how the cattle were doing in the north pasture. I wanted to check sure the water troughs hadn't frozen solid, because the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees overnight. When I arrived at the pasture, it was still dark, and the only light piercing the pre-dawn darkness was my flashlight. Everything I discovered there contradicted all of my 34 years of farming experience. I had 7 dead Black Angus cattle, lying in the snow in what seemed to be a perfect circle around the water trough. Not ill, not hurt, just dead. Every animal was arranged precisely the same way, with its legs extending straight out from its body and its head pointing toward the center of the circle while it lay on its left side. There were no traces from cars or predators, no blood in the snow, and no indications of struggle. Throughout my adult life, I had been a cow farmer and witnessed the deaths of animals due to illness, trauma, predator assaults, and extreme weather conditions. However, this was unlike anything I had ever seen. For no obvious reason, healthy adult cattle weighing more than 1,000 pounds each do not just lie down in geometric designs and die all at once. I contacted Dr. Rebecca Martinez, our veterinarian, who had been caring for our pets for more than 10 years. Within an hour she was there, and as she inspected the carcasses, I could see the bewilderment on her face. She examined the remaining cattle for symptoms of disease or poisoning, collected tissue samples, and took pictures of the area. Every other animal seemed to be in excellent health. The tissue samples were transferred by Dr. Martinez to a Calgary laboratory for examination. 2 weeks later, the results were returned, but they offered no explanations, no indications of illness, no traces of poison, and no clue as to what might have caused the fatalities. The cattle had just stopped existing, based on all the tests the lab could run. However, that was just the start. 3 nights later, at around 2 in the morning, my wife Sarah woke me up by whispering that there were lights in the north pasture and shaking my shoulder. I noticed odd lights slowly traveling over the area where I had seen the dead calves when I peered out our bedroom window. They were neither a flashlight beam nor a car's headlights. I picked up my gun and my heaviest winter coat and went outside to check these lights, which had a soft blue-white radiance and appeared to be hovering around 3 feet above the ground. They moved in odd patterns as if they were looking for something. Although Sarah pleaded with me not to go alone, I instructed her to stay at home with our 2 kids and to call the RCMP if I didn't return in an hour. The wind was slicing across the open fields like a knife, and the temperature outside was harsh, likely near 30. The lights abruptly went off and started to dim as I was approaching the north pasture. They had vanished entirely by the time I got to the fence line. However, there was another issue with the scene. After days of wind, the pasture's snow was not as smooth as it should have been. Rather, there were inscriptions in a language I didn't understand, geometric shapes that resembled symbols, or patterns pressed into the snow. The patterns, which were centered on the location where I had discovered the dead animals, encompassed an area roughly 50 feet in diameter. The snow imprints were uniformly deep and flawlessly created, with crisp edges. I could see no tracks heading to or from the location, but whatever had made them must have been heavy enough to compress the snow. I went back to the house after taking pictures with my phone, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I drove back out to the meadow the following morning to look at the patterns in the daylight, but the wind had blown the snow clean and the odd symbols were nowhere to be seen. The lights reappeared 4 more times in the following 2 weeks, always in the same approximate vicinity, and usually between midnight and 4:00 a.m. Every time I made an effort to go close enough to observe what was producing them, they would quickly disappear as soon as I got close. Insisting that something was watching the house from the tree line that surrounded our property to the east, Sarah began to have trouble sleeping and would startle at every noise outdoors. Then everything changed on the evening of December 15th. It was a sound I had never heard before that woke me up, not Sarah. It was unlike anything I could explain, and it was coming from outdoors somewhere close to the barn. Consider the sound of wind through a tunnel, but with a heartbeat-like underlying rhythm and sporadic, harsh notes that sounded almost like screams. My gut turned, and my skin crawled at the sound's eerie quality. A figure was standing in our yard, about 30 feet from the house, when I peeked out the window. The figure was abnormally skinny and tall, most likely around 7 feet. I knew that its proportions were off, even from a distance and in the dark. Its head appeared extremely small for its body, and its arms were too long, drooping beyond its knees. It faced the house, and even though I couldn't see any features of its face, I got the unshakable feeling that it was staring right at me. For what seemed like an eternity, but was probably just 2 or 3 minutes, the figure remained still. Then, with a peculiar shambling gait that seemed to float just above the ground rather than take actual steps, it turned and started toward the treen. I shouted for the creature to stop and reveal itself as I snatched up my rifle and flashlight and dashed outside. However, it had disappeared into the trees by the time I arrived at the location where it had stood. I followed its footprints in the snow, but they abruptly stopped after 20 feet or so. No broken branches, no prints pointing farther into the woods, and no indication of the figure's possible whereabouts were found. However, the tracks stopped at something else in the snow. Although it was the carcass of a deer, it appeared healthy and uninjured, just like the cattle. In the same position as the dead cow, the deer lay on its side, its legs straight out from its body, its head pointing toward the house. However, the time since I'd seen the figure was only a few minutes. This deer had been dead for much longer. The carcass had been there for days because it was frozen solid and had some snow on it. I reported the incidents to the Dawson Creek RCMP detachment over the phone the next morning. That afternoon, Constable David Thompson showed up to interview the witness and review the evidence. Although he was meticulous and competent, I could see he didn't believe what I had told him about the tall figure and the odd lights. But when I showed him the deer carcass and the pictures I had shot of the killed cow, his perspective shifted. Constable Thompson had grown up in the area and had hunting and agricultural experience. He could not explain how 7 healthy cattle could all die at once for no apparent reason, and he was aware that the animals' placement was not natural. He recommended that I speak with Dr. James White, an elder from the nearby Danza First Nation, as he may possess traditional knowledge that could shed light on the events occurring on my property. The Danza people had been in the Peace River area for thousands of years, according to Constable Thompson, and they had knowledge of the territory that predates European settlers by many generations. Although I had my doubts about using traditional indigenous sources for assistance, I was desperate enough to attempt anything. Dr. Whitehorse consented to see me the next day, and his face became more grave as I told him what had happened on my land. He informed me that the Danza people regarded the ground where my farm was situated as having mystical significance. There was a horrific catastrophe that happened at a winter camp there in the distant past, according to their oral traditions. A number of families had been stranded there during a particularly severe winter, and as wildlife became limited and their food supplies ran out, they all perished from starvation. According to the Danza legend, those who perished from malnutrition in such conditions would turn into Wendigo, cannibalistic ghosts, who were never content and were always hungry, Dr. Whitehorse added. It was supposed that these ghosts roamed the area where they perished, looking for food and becoming more powerful with every life they claimed. He informed me that the tall, abnormally thin person I had seen fit traditional accounts of these spirits, and that the geometric patterns I had noticed in the snow were comparable with traditional descriptions of window marks. Animals were dying for no apparent reason, which implied that the Wendigo was consuming their life force and becoming more powerful and fearless with every death. Dr. Whitehorse cautioned me that if the window was active on my property, it would not be content to continue killing merely animals. It would start attacking people as it got stronger, focusing on those who lived closest to its region. He offered to do a customary cleansing ritual on my land, but he warned that these rituals were not always effective, particularly if the window had already grown extremely strong. He also cautioned me that before the spirit was exiled, the ceremony might enrage it and make it more hostile. I struggled to balance my increasing concern for my family's safety with my logical doubt. The idea of supernatural spirits was rejected by the scientific side of my thinking, but I was unable to use any traditional explanations to explain what was occurring on my land, and the occurrences were growing more frequent and unsettling. 2 nights later, the choice was made for me. Sarah woke me up around 3 in the morning, pointing to our kids' bedroom while violently shaking me. I heard someone walking around upstairs in the hallway outside the kids' rooms, she murmured. However, neither of our kids had a habit of waking up in the middle of the night, and they both slept soundly. Taking my rifle, I slipped upstairs as stealthily as possible. I could see that the doors to both children's bedrooms were open despite the darkness in the corridor. Both were intended to be closed. I started by going into my daughter Emma's room, where she was soundly asleep in her bed. However, my blood turned cold when I entered my son Tyler's room. Tyler sat awake in his bed, gazing out the window of his bedroom. He was just staring with an expression I had never seen on his 8-year-old face before. He was not blinking or moving. I muttered his name, but he didn't answer or even recognize me. I followed his eyes to the window, where the towering guy the first had previously seen stood outside in our backyard. However, I could see more details this time because it was considerably closer, just 10 feet or so from the house. Its grayish-white skin was tautly stretched over bones that appeared to protrude at odd angles. Its eyes flashed a faint blue, and its face was hollow and emaciated, with sunken cheeks. 2 long, 2-pointed teeth showed through its open mouth. Tyler was looking back, and the person was staring right at him. They were both motionless and silent. I brought my rifle up and pointed it at the person. But before I could shoot, it swung its mouth wide and made a noise that was a combination of growl, shriek, and something else I couldn't even explain. The sound seemed to reverberate through my bones, since it was so loud and strange. The figure turned and vanished into the night, and Tyler instantly collapsed back into his bed, asleep. I hurried over to check Tyler's respiration and pulse. He was still alive, but no matter how hard I tried, I was unable to stir him up, since his skin felt cold to the touch. After Sarah called for an ambulance, we hurried him to Dawson Creek Hospital. There was nothing the doctors could find wrong with Tyler. His vital indicators were within normal limits. He stayed comatose for 3 days, even though his blood tests were clear and showed no symptoms of sickness or damage. Furthermore, he had no recollection of the events of that night when he eventually woke up, but Tyler had altered in some way. Even though he had been receiving IV nutrition at the hospital for those 3 days, he had lost weight. Gray streaks had appeared in his hair where none had previously been. And there were now flecks of pale blue in his eyes, which had always been brown like mine. I realized then that Dr. Whitehorse had been correct. There was something on my land that wasn't natural, and it was growing more powerful. The following day, I gave Dr. Whitehorse a call and consented to the customary cleansing procedure. He and 2 other elders from his community came the next evening, and they spent the whole night conducting ceremonies on my land. They performed rites in the Danza language, which I did not understand, sang traditional songs, and burned sweetgrass and sage. The ceremony appeared to be successful. After that night, I never saw the tall figure again, and the weird lights never came back. No more livestock perished under unexplained circumstances, and the remaining cattle remained healthy. But there was a price for the quiet. After meeting the Wendigo, Tyler never entirely recovered. He became a timid, reserved youngster who shunned the outdoors and wouldn't discuss what had transpired that winter. The flecks of pale blue that were a constant reminder of the night something inhuman had attempted to take my son's soul were also occasionally visible to me when the light struck his eyes just right. The land has been in my family for 3 generations, and I continue to work it. I don't take its history for granted anymore, though. Skepticism cannot overcome the forces in this world that science cannot explain. And sometimes, admitting that there are things you don't understand and asking for assistance from individuals who possess generations' worth of wisdom is the only way to keep the people you care about safe. Music in search of tranquility, I, Indiana Santos, a professional sound engineer, relocated to Lillooet, British Columbia, in the spring of 2021. I was exhausted by the bustle and commotion of the city after working in Vancouver recording studios for 15 years, mixing rock band albums and creating television program soundtracks. Instead, I made a recording that will plague me for the rest of my life during my first year in this small mountain village. Lillooet is located roughly 250 kilometers northeast of Vancouver in the Fraser Canyon. Additionally, it's one of those locations where the mountains appear to swallow sound instead of reflecting it. The majority of the town's just over 2,000 residents have been there for several generations. I wanted a calm, secluded setting like that to restart my profession and even begin focusing on some personal projects I had been putting off for years. I purchased a modest home on the outskirts of town, near the intersection of the residential neighborhood and the wilderness that extends northward to the Caribou Mountains. The detached garage that was included with the house was ideal for turning into a home recording studio. I put up my mixing board and monitors, installed professional-grade acoustic insulation, and calibrated my equipment to record the purest sound quality during my first 3 months there. I was prepared to start working on an ambient music record that would feature natural sounds from the British Columbia backcountry by August, when my studio was up and running. To produce a piece that would convey the sense of isolation in the mountains, I intended to record hours of ambient noise in various seasons and weather situations, then overlay those recordings with synthesized music. I began by placing remote recording equipment in several spots across the forest and my property. I owned a number of top-of-the-line field recorders that could run on batteries for weeks at a time, recording sounds around the clock with little assistance from humans. I placed them in clearings where I wanted to catch intriguing bird noises, or wind patterns in deeper areas of the forest where I intended to record the subtle sounds of wildlife moving through the underbrush, and close to Talon Creek, which ran behind my property. The initial weeks of recording were just as I had anticipated. Water flowing for hours, pine trees rustling in the breeze, the rustle of tiny critters in the forest, and the occasional lawn's call. I was receiving crisp, lovely audio that would be ideal for my intended ambient project. Early in September, however, a change occurred. I was listening to the recordings from the device I had set up near Talon Creek the night before when I noticed something odd in the audio file. I heard what sounded like human voices conversing around 50 feet away from the microphone at 3:27 in the morning, which should have been the quietest time of the night. I initially thought it was either local youths who had been partying by the creek or hikers who were out late. However, I became aware that the voices were not in English as I listened more intently through my work headphones. Indeed, they were not using any language that I could recognize, yet throughout the years, I had collaborated with singers and musicians from dozens of various nations. At least 3 different voices, all male, were involved in the roughly 7-minute-long talk. They seemed to be talking about something significant because of the solemn, almost formal tone. However, the language itself was entirely unfamiliar to me. I was unsure if human throats could generate some of the sounds, and the phonetic patterns did not correspond to any European, Asian, or indigenous languages I had ever heard. In the hopes that someone might understand the language, or at least be able to explain who would have been out by the creek in the middle of the night, I created a digital copy of the audio clip and played it for a number of people in town. However, none of the people I talked to knew what the voices were saying or their possible origin. I made the decision to keep a closer eye on the recordings. I also recorded comparable conversations 3 more times over the course of the following 2 weeks. Speaking in the same unintelligible language, the voices consistently surfaced between 2 and 4 in the morning, always close to the creek. I was starting to get concerned that my property was being used for illicit purposes because the discussions were getting longer and more frequent. However, I later captured something that caused me to wonder if the sounds were actually human. My equipment recorded what sounded like the same 3 voices conversing again along the creek on the evening of September 23rd. But this time, one of the voices started talking about things I knew had happened. The voice was giving what sounded like a full description of my everyday actions for the past week, in this strange, impossible language. I am positive that the voice was referring to me, even though I realize this sounds crazy. It detailed the order in which I visited various stores and the precise products I bought when I drove into town on Monday to buy food. It detailed the contents of my Tuesday night phone discussion with my former business partner in Vancouver, including information that could only have been known by those who had been listening to both sides of the call. Most unsettling of all, the voice recounted intimate moments that could not have been seen by an outsider within my home. It was aware that I had been taking melatonin tablets before bed because I was having problems falling asleep. It was aware that I had been working on a musical composition that included thunderstorm recordings. In some way, it was aware of personal information about me that I had kept private. As though they were getting a report from someone who had been tasked with keeping an eye on me, the other 2 voices gave their approval and encouragement in response to this information. In an attempt to catch whoever was spying on my land, I began staying up late and monitoring the creek area, but I never saw anyone and the voices never came when I was actively listening for them. Only when I was asleep in my home, totally oblivious to anything out of the ordinary, did they appear on the recordings. The recordings then took an even more unsettling turn in early October. Within days of being recorded, the voices started to describe events that had not yet occurred, but did. One of the voices in a conversation I captured on October 5th talked about an automobile collision between a blue pickup truck and a logging truck that will happen on Highway 99, just south of Lillooet. The voice gave precise information on the weather, the time of day, and the injuries that would be sustained in the collision. 3 days later, during an afternoon rainfall on Highway 99, a blue pickup truck and a logging truck collided, just as the audio states. The accident happened at the exact moment that had been mentioned, and the pickup truck driver sustained the same injuries that had been foreseen in the enigmatic chat. When I tried to explain what I had filmed to the Lillooet RCMP detachment, I could tell that Constable Michael Peterson believed I was either mentally ill or attempting to pull a hoax. He listened to the audio files I provided for him, but he either said I might have misinterpreted the voices or brushed them off as coincidence. However, I continued to record, and the predictions continued to materialize. The voices explained a home fire that will break out on First Avenue on October 12th, including the room where the fire would begin and the escape route for the residents. As the voices had foreseen, the Henderson family's home on First Avenue caught fire in the kitchen 2 days later. The family fled through the window of their bedroom, as the recording had stated. The voices said that on October 19th, while walking her dog close to the community center, Margaret Chen, the old librarian, would trip and break her hip. They stated that her daughter would be in the hospital for 6 weeks, that it would occur on a Tuesday morning at around 9:30 a.m., and that her dog would run home to warn her. The next Tuesday, at 9:28 a.m., Margaret Chen was walking her dog close to the community center when she fell and broke her hip. Her daughter was led back to Margaret's damaged state by her dog, who raced home. She spent precisely 6 weeks in the hospital. I was both frightened and, from a scientific standpoint, enthralled. I was trained as a sound engineer to objectively evaluate audio and spot any indications of falsification or modification. However, these tapes were entirely genuine. There was no indication of digital editing or post-production enhancement because the sounds were being recorded live and in real time. I started looking for similar incidents online and found that individuals have recorded enigmatic voices that appear to have knowledge of future events throughout history. The technical quality of my recordings prevented me from questioning what I was hearing, even though these situations are frequently written off as hoaxes or psychological aberrations. I also discovered that Lillooet is situated in a region with important electromagnetic and geological characteristics. The town is encircled by mountains that are rich in quartz and other crystalline minerals, and it is situated at the meeting point of 2 significant river systems. Although conventional science denies these views, some researchers have hypothesized that specific geographic areas can serve as natural amplifiers for paranormal phenomena. I made a choice at the end of October that would completely alter the course of my circumstances. I made the decision to attempt direct communication with the voices rather than only passively recording them. Up till 200 a.m. I waited. October 28th. I then took a handheld recorder and a megaphone that I had borrowed from the local fire station to the creek. I took a position close to where the voices typically appeared and started talking in English, inquiring about their identities and methods for making predictions about the future. Initially, there was no answer. However, after chatting into the dark for 10 or so minutes, I heard a familiar voice reply from someplace in the forest behind me. The tone of the voice was changed, but it was still utilizing the same weird vocabulary. This voice sounded astonished, almost alarmed, rather than the professional conversational tone I had been used to. I heard the other 2 voices answering from various places around me as the voice shouted out multiple times. They were approaching my location via the forest, and their tone was growing more and more aggressive. Then an impossibility occurred. Perfect English came out of one of the voices. The voice from someplace in the trees to my left murmured, "You shouldn't be here." I questioned them about who they were and how they were aware of what was going to happen next. "You should not be listening." However, the voice disregarded my inquiries. The message read, "The recordings will stop now." I asked to know what gave them the authority to spy on me and threaten me, but the voice interrupted, saying, "You will forget what you have heard. You will leave this place. We are not what you think we are," it stated. The voice clarified that certain places under particular circumstances can produce temporal anomalies that permit sound waves to travel backward through time, saying, "We are not from when you think we are. The sounds you have been hearing are echoes from tomorrow, reflections of conversations that have not yet occurred in your timeline." What I had been recording were future discussions that somehow made their way into the present through Fraser Canyon-specific natural electromagnetic phenomena. "However, you have interrupted the procedure," the voice went on. "You have produced a paradox that jeopardizes the timeline's integrity by becoming conscious of the echoes. Because you have been unintentionally manipulating circumstances to match what you heard in the recordings, the prophecies have been coming true." The voice's response to my question about why they were telling me this made me feel really cold. Because the paradox will get worse if you keep recording and listening. Things will start to shift in ways that can't be undone. Those who were destined to live will pass away. Others who were destined to perish will survive. There will be instability in the future itself. The voice instructed me to permanently leave Lillette and erase all of my recordings within 48 hours. Regardless of the repercussions for me, they would take action to guarantee that the temporal disruption was contained if I disobeyed. All three of their voices became silent as I tried to ask additional questions, and I could hear them walking away through the forest until their footsteps were no longer audible. After getting home, I spent the remainder of the night going over all of the recordings I had made since relocating to Lillooet. I observed patterns I had not before noticed in the context of what the voice had informed me. Not only were the prophecies coming true, but they were happening because I had heard them and had unwittingly done things that made them likely. I had called the library to see how Margaret Chen was doing after hearing about her anticipated fall, which caused her to become anxious and distracted during her morning stroll. I had passed the Henderson residence multiple times when I learned of the house fire, and my presence in the neighborhood may have affected the sequence of events that resulted in the fire. The consequences were frightening me, but I wasn't prepared to give up on what I had learned. I chose to pack up my most valuable equipment and relocate to a motel in Kamloops while I considered my options, rather than disposing of the tapes as directed. However, the voices had been serious about taking action to control the situation. When I woke up on my last morning in Lillooet, I discovered that all of the technological devices in my home had been destroyed. I melted my mixing board. My field recorders had been crushed to heaps of metal and plastic parts, and my computer hard drives had been wiped clean. No natural phenomena could have caused the damage since it was too exact and comprehensive. Even more unsettling was finding that my backup recordings, which I had kept in a fireproof safe, were no longer there. Physically gone, but not destroyed, as though someone had opened the safe and taken only the particular files pertaining to the enigmatic sounds. That same day, I packed up the last items I owned and departed Lillooet. I finally went back to work in commercial recording studios after relocating to Vancouver. However, I will always remember my experiences in that small mountain village. I occasionally work alone in a studio late at night. Those inconceivable sounds, speaking their unknown language, seem to be echoing in my mind. And occasionally, I question whether the future I'm living today is the same one that was always intended. Or if, for some reason, my 48 hours in Lillooet altered the course of events in ways I can never really comprehend. I discovered that some knowledge is too harmful for humans to acquire, and that there are forces in the cosmos that function beyond our comprehension of time and causation. Though it may appear like a blessing, the capacity to hear the talks of tomorrow now is essentially a scourge that jeopardizes reality itself. The voices that somehow knew every detail of my past and our shared destiny are still present in my nightmares about Talon Creek. And I hope that I will never again be in a situation where the lines separating the past from the present are as hazy as the mountain air. The death of 16-year-old Janae Williams revealed the worst secrets that our remote northern community had been concealing for decades. My name is Constable Dion Baptiste. What started off as a standard investigation into a high school student's death turned revealed to be a multi-generational plot of corruption and cover-up involving some of Flin Flon, Manitoba's most well-respected residents. Flin Flon is located almost 600 kilometers north of Winnipeg, directly on the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border. Built around the enormous copper and zinc reserves that were found in the 1920s and for over a century, it is a mining town. The community's vitality was derived from the mining. In the 1970s, the population reached a peak of about 10,000, but by 2020, there were only about 5,000 people left. The majority of them were elderly residents who had lived there their entire lives. When Janie Williams was discovered dead early on March 15, 2021, I had been a Flin, Florida RCMP constable for 3 years. She was discovered by a group of adolescents who had been investigating the abandoned buildings around the old Hudson Bay mining and smelting complex that had been shut down the previous year. Jana lay in a chamber that still held coils of old cable and corroded gear in what had been the main building used for storing equipment. Her body revealed that she had struggled hard against her assailant, and she had been strangled. The most unsettling aspect of the image, however, was that she had obviously been placed there on purpose, arranged such that it appeared her killer wanted her to be discovered. The lone high school in town, Hapnot Collegiate, was where Jana Williams was a junior. She was a quiet girl who avoided trouble and excelled academically. She shared a modest home on the south side of town with her mother, Patricia Williams. Patricia worked 2 jobs to support herself and her father when he left when she was 7 years old. By all accounts, Janae was a conscientious girl who worked part-time at the neighborhood grocery store to assist her mother with home costs. The inquiry began as usual. I conducted interviews with Jana's co-workers, professors, students, and anybody else who could know something about what she was up to in the days before she passed away. According to everyone I talked to, she was a quiet, smart girl who had no enemies or disputes with others. However, as I learned more about Jana's background, I found that she had been working on a project for her Canadian history class that had put her in a delicate position. For her last semester project, Jana decided to study the history of residential schools in northern Manitoba, according to Mrs. Eleanor Sanderson, her history teacher. The Gordon Indian Residential School, which was in operation from 1888 until 1996, some 30 kilometers south of Flynn, Florida, had piqued her curiosity. In an effort to chronicle the experiences of Indigenous children who were compelled to attend the residential school, Jana had been spending time at the local library searching through government records and old newspaper archives, Mrs. Anderson stated. Although Jana's study was delicate, Mrs. Sanderson had supported her because she believed it was critical that children comprehend the historical injustices that had taken place in their own area. According to Mrs. Sanderson, however, about 2 weeks before to her passing, Jana had visited her, thrilled about some documents she had found that she thought demonstrated a cover-up concerning deaths at the residential school. Jana asserted that she had discovered proof that local authorities had assisted in stifling inquiries into the strange deaths of multiple youngsters at the school. Jana was confident that she was on to something significant, but Mrs. Sanderson informed me that she had cautioned her about making allegations without strong evidence. At the end of March, she was going to present her findings as part of her history project. I made the decision to look at the resources Jana had been using. I therefore visited the Flynn, Florida Public Library and had a conversation with Dorothy McKinnon, the chief librarian. Mrs. McKinnon recalled Janet vividly and attested to the fact that she had been visiting the library multiple times a week since January, spending hours in the archives area looking through old government records and newspapers. I was shown the materials Janet had been studying by Mrs. McKinnon. A number of boxes of documents were presented to the library by the estate of a former government administrator who passed away in 2018. However, the most were ordinary historical records. These records contained letters exchanged between Gordon Residential School Administration, local politicians, and federal representatives. I started to see what had drawn Jana's attention as I went through the materials. There were several letters from the 1950s and 1960s that highlighted concerns about the health and welfare of youngsters at the residential school. More importantly, however, were memos that implied local officials had been told to keep the public's awareness of the school's issues to a minimum. A letter from September 1963 was one document that really drew my eye. Dr. Harold Mason, the town's sole physician at the time, wrote it. Over the course of 2 years, Dr. Mason had written to federal authorities to voice concerns about an abnormally high number of child deaths at the residential school. According to the correspondence, he had suggested a formal investigation, but Ottawa officials had turned it off. The fact that Robert Mason, our present mayor, was descended from Dr. Mason made this paper very intriguing. Robert Mason had served as mayor for more than 10 years, and the Mason family had been well known in Flynn, Florida for 3 generations. In order to learn more about his grandfather's worries about the residential school, I chose to speak with Mayor Mason. His secretary informed me that the mayor was out of town on business and would not be accessible for a few days when I called his office to request a meeting. However, his car was in the driveway and the lights were on as I passed his house that night. When I attempted to contact the mayor's office again the following morning, I was informed that Mayor Mason had directed his employees to direct all questions regarding historical issues to the town's legal counsel. When I called the legal office, I was told that the town would not be commenting on any matters linked to the residential school without a formal written request that would need to be considered by the town council. These answers appeared remarkably defensive for what ought to have been a simple historical investigation. I started to think that Jaina had found something that was quite unsettling to the town's influential individuals. When I got back to the library, I asked Mrs. McKinnon if she could recall Janae expressing special interest in any particular documents. Janae had been particularly interested in a box of items from the estate of Thomas Hartley, the town's police chief from 1955 until 1982, she informed me. I think Janet found what I found when I looked through the Hartley records. Investigations into the deaths of children who had fled the residential school were covered in a number of police reports from the 1960s. But these reports were marked as closed without resolution, and handwritten notes in the margins implied that the investigations had been stopped by federal authorities. Carbon copies of letters written by Chief Hartley to federal officials expressing his irritation at being stopped from conducting a thorough investigation into these fatalities were even more unsettling. Hartley claimed to have evidence that several of the children had been murdered in a 1967 letter, but he was told to categorize their deaths as natural causes or accidents. Chief Hartley's 1979 letter to his successor was the last item in the Hartley collection. Hartley cautioned in this letter that those in positions of power would be held responsible for their part in concealing atrocities against children if the truth about the residential school fatalities was revealed. I now thought Janae's own death was related to her inquiry into a decades-old plot to cover up murders at the residential school and that she had found evidence of it. But before I could level charges against well-known community members, I needed additional proof. I made the decision to speak with Jaina's mother, Patricia Williams, in greater detail regarding her daughter's research endeavors. According to Patricia, Jaina had been thrilled about her history project, but in the weeks leading up to her passing, she also appeared anxious about something. Patricia said that Jaina had said that her research on the residential school had caused some people in town to be unhappy. She had informed her mother that she felt like she was being watched when she went to the library, but she had not given specifics. Patricia also told me something that changed the course of my research. She stated that Mayor Mason had visited their home around a week prior to Jaina's passing and requested a private conversation with her. Although Patricia was not there for the discussion, Jaina later became agitated and would not discuss the mayor's request. No matter how hard Mayor Mason tried to avoid talking to me, I knew I had to face him head-on. That night, I went over to his place and demanded to talk to him about his chat with Jaina Williams. Mayor Mason was evasive and defensive when he finally consented to meet with me. Although he acknowledged that he had discussed Jaina's study subject with her, he stated that his only intention was to provide direction and background information. He stated that he had been worried that a high school student would interpret historical records incorrectly if they were not properly contextualized. However, Mayor Mason's discomfort increased when I asked him about specifics. He asserted that he had merely been attempting to assist Jaina with her studies, but he said he was unable to recall exactly what they had talked. I got all the information I needed from Mayor Mason's response when I questioned him directly if he knew that his grandfather had recorded worries about fatalities at the residential school. His face turned white, and he started stuttering about how historical records may be deceptive, and that people shouldn't make snap judgments about things that happened decades ago. I wanted proof that would link Mayor Mason to her murder, but I knew at that moment that he was complicit in hiding whatever Jaina had found. Unexpectedly, the breakthrough was made. Someone claiming to have information regarding Jaina's death called me anonymously 2 days after I spoke with Mayor Mason. I was instructed to investigate the basement of the old town hall building, which had been abandoned since the construction of the new municipal offices in 2005 by the caller, who sounded like an elderly guy. Along with a Winnipeg forensics team, I secured a search warrant and went into the ancient town hall's basement. There, we discovered a stockpile of documents that had reportedly been kept secret for many years. Photographs and suppressed witness testimony were among the documents, as were the original, unedited police reports from the investigations conducted in the 1960s. Most importantly, however, we discovered a thorough confession letter that Thomas Hartley had written just before he passed away in 1998. Hartley acknowledged in this letter that he had been under pressure from local politicians and federal authorities to conceal the killings of at least 7 Native youngsters who had fled the residential school. The children had not perished from exposure or accidents as stated in the official papers, according to Hartley's confession. A group of local men who had been recruited to find fugitives and bring them back to the school had slain them. Several of the children had perished from their injuries, and the men had used extreme force when some of the children struggled. Harold Mason, Robert Mason's grandpa, was one of the individuals identified in Hartley's letter as having participated in the cover-up. Additionally, it showed that the Mason family's current generation had been trying to conceal the truth about their grandfather's involvement in the plot. According to the letter, Hartley had concealed these records out of concern for his own safety should he come clean, while the parties concerned were still alive. However, he had hoped that someone would eventually locate the records and make sure that justice was done. Mayor Mason broke down and confessed to killing Janae Williams after being shown Hartley's confession letter. He clarified that Jana had uncovered proof of the Mason family's financial gain from federal compensation payments intended for survivors of residential schools, in addition to the historical cover-up. For more than 10 years, Mayor Mason had been siphoning off cash intended for Native American villages by exploiting his position and his family's long-standing links to transfer funds into personal accounts. Mayor Mason had felt compelled to quiet Janae when she threatened to reveal the continuing financial crimes as well as the previous deaths. Robert Mason was taken into custody and accused of several counts of embezzlement and fraud, in addition to first-degree murder. Following his incarceration, a more thorough investigation turned up evidence of a crooked network that included many other well-known families in Flin Flan who had conspired to conceal crimes and embezzle funds intended for Native American communities. In addition to solving a murder, the Janet Williams case became a landmark in Canadian legal history because it ultimately delivered justice to the Indigenous children who had been murdered decades earlier. Several families were compensated for the killings of their relatives, and the federal government formed a special committee to look into all deaths at residential schools in northern Manitoba. However, the case served as a reminder to me that evil can lurk for generations behind the cover of respectability and power, waiting for someone with the courage to throw a light on the darkness. Even though Janae Williams was just 16, she had the guts to speak up when others would have opted to remain silent. Even though her murder was tragic, her research made sure that justice was eventually served and that the voices of the children who had been slain were heard. I'm a paranormal investigator named Jaslyn Patel, and my understanding of the relationship between historical trauma and supernatural activity was altered by the instance I'm about to share with you at the historic Métis community of Beauce, Saskatchewan, when I discovered that the ghosts haunting a contemporary family were the echoes of a tragedy that took place at one of the worst periods in Canadian history. What had started out as a regular research into poltergeist occurrences took on a much greater significance. After 8 years of working as a paranormal investigator, I got a call in October 2012 from Sarah Kalin, who lived in a century-old farmhouse about 15 kilometers from Rosen with her husband and 2 kids. Sarah, who was in dire need of assistance with what she characterized as increasingly aggressive supernatural activity in her home, came across my contact information on a website dedicated to paranormal investigations. Sarah clarified that although her family had been dealing with odd occurrences for a few months, things had significantly increased in the last few weeks. On their own, doors were slamming shut, frequently with enough power to rattle windows all across the house. No one was around to move the objects that were being tossed across rooms. The 2 kids in the household, ages 6 and 9, were waking up with bruises and scrapes that weren't there when they went to sleep. Most unsettling, Sarah reported that she and her spouse had been hearing voices in the middle of the night, speaking in what sounded like French, coming from vacant rooms. Over time, the voices seemed to grow louder and more frequent, and they sounded desperate and angry. I consented to make an initial inspection at the Kalin residence the next weekend. The property was situated in a rural area of Saskatchewan, with prairie grassland and wheat farms extending to the horizon on all sides. Built in the early 1900s, the house was a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch that had seen better days and white clapboard exterior. I could tell the stress the supernatural activity was causing the Kalin family as soon as I met them. Sarah was jittery and tired, flinching at the slightest noise. Although he remained dubious of paranormal explanations, her husband Michael acknowledged that he was unable to come up with a logical explanation for what was occurring in their house. Emma and Jacob, their kids, refused to play by themselves in any room of the house and appeared afraid and reclusive. I interviewed each member of the family separately about their experiences during the first evening. The activities began soon after they moved into the residence in March 2020, according to Sarah. Initially, it had been small-scale events that could be attributed to imagination or chance. They would find doors standing open that they were positive they had closed. Things would be moved from their original placement, typically to areas that appeared purposefully dangerous or unpleasant. However, the activity had escalated by summer. Sarah recounted an incident that happened in July while she was in the kitchen making dinner, and turned around to discover that, despite not having touched any of the cabinet doors or drawers, they were all standing open. On another occasion, she was in the living room washing clothes when a big wooden chair was thrown across the room, almost missing her. Although he was more hesitant to talk about it, Michael eventually acknowledged that he had heard the French voices multiple times. He could understand some of what was being said because he was raised in Saskatchewan and had taken French classes in school. Michael claimed that the voices appeared to be arguing, with several individuals yelling at one another about death, betrayal, and land. The most unsettling experiences were those of the kids. Jacob and Emma both claimed to have seen shadowy beings in their bedrooms at night, sitting in the corners of their rooms or standing at the foot of their beds. The individuals were dressed in traditional attire and seemed to be adults, both male and female. According to the youngsters, the figures appeared dejected and irate, and occasionally they would make gestures toward them as though they were attempting to speak. That first night, I arranged my investigative tools all throughout the house. I placed digital recorders in every room to capture any voices or sounds that couldn't be explained. I put motion-activated cameras in the communal rooms and corridors. Wherever the family reported the most activity, I set up electromagnetic field detectors. My gadget started capturing activities at around 2:30 in the morning. Abrupt surges in electromagnetic energy that lasted for many minutes were detected by the EMF detectors in the dining area and kitchen. Videos of doors opening and closing by themselves were recorded by the motion cameras. Above all, the digital recorders recorded distinct audio of several French-speaking voices. The following morning, I listened to the audio recordings and verified that the voices were, in fact, speaking French. More precisely, what sounded like an earlier dialect of French that would have been widely spoken in the late 19th century. Frequently mentioning "Notre land led the soldiers" and "justice," the voices appeared to be having furious conversations. The historical allusions and the French language made me think that the supernatural activity might have something to do with the Maté people, who had inhabited the area in the late 19th century. Although I was aware that Boss had played a key role in the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, I still needed to learn more about the particular history of the area where the Kalin House stood. I reached out to Dr. Marie Dubois, a historian who specializes in the Northwest Rebellion and Métis history at the University of Saskatchewan. Because Dr. Dubois knew the neighborhood where the Kalin House was, she gave me information that fundamentally altered my perception of what was going on there. Dr. Dubois stated that the Kalin home was constructed on property that had once been a Bellinger family Maté farm. Along with their 4 children and Francois's aging parents, Francois and Marie-Claire Bellinger had set up their homestead there in 1882. Under the direction of Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont, the Maté people, including the Bellinger, had made their home in the Saskatchewan Valley. The Canadian government had dispatched military forces to quell the Maté resistance during the Northwest Rebellion in 1885. Their estate had served as a gathering point and supply store for Maté militants, and the Bellinger had backed Riel's interim government. The Bells and their family were massacred on May 20, 1885, when government forces assaulted their homestead, according to historical documents that Dr. Dubois had studied. Only 8 days following Boss's downfall, the Canadian military had not formally recorded the attack on the Bellinger farm, and the family members' deaths had been concealed to prevent attention from being drawn to what was effectively the execution of civilians who were not involved in conflict. Instead, then portraying the crushing of the uprising as a campaign of genocide against Maté families, The administration sought to show it as a lawful military action against armed insurgents. Dr. Dubois informed me that the Belange family had not been offered the chance to surrender, in accordance with oral traditions that have been kept by the remaining Mattei group. At morning, the soldiers had surrounded the house, burned it, and shot anyone attempting to flee. The attack had claimed the lives of Francois's parents, Marie, Claire, and their 4 children. The Canadian government had taken Mattei lands and given them to European immigrants after the uprising was put down. Eventually, a homesteader from Ontario purchased the Belange farm and constructed a new home on the site of the original Mattei house. The Catlin family's new home was basically the same building, but it had undergone multiple expansions and reconstructions over the years. Equipped with this historical data, I went back to the Catlin residence to carry out a more targeted inquiry. This time, I invited Joseph Paranto, a local Mattei elder who was familiar with the oral history of the 1885 insurrection and traditional spiritual practices, along with Dr. Dubois. After listening to my recordings of the French voices, Mr. Paranto verified that the speakers were using the Mishi dialect, which was widely used by the Saskatchewan Mattei in the 1880s. More importantly, he was able to identify some of the terms and allusions that were used in the recordings. The voices discussed their demand for justice and a dignified funeral, the theft of their land, and the murder of their children. Mr. Paranto claimed that the Belange family had never been granted the right to a dignified funeral. Mattei tradition states that because their community had never recognized or grieved their deaths, their bodies had been interred in unmarked graves, and their spirits had been unable to find peace. Their rage and their intense need for acceptance and justice were expressed through the paranormal activity in the Catlin home. According to Mr. Paranto, those who passed away unfairly or violently may find themselves torn between the realm of the living and the world of the dead in the Mattei spiritual tradition. Until their complaints were resolved, these ghosts would remain in the locations where they had resided and passed away. Additionally, they received the appropriate spiritual direction to proceed to the next life. In order to assist the Belange family in finding peace, he offered to lead a traditional Mattei ritual. However, he cautioned that such ceremonies were intricate and needed the involvement of the entire community. The ghosts needed to know that their descendants respected their sacrifice, that their narrative was remembered, and that their deaths were recognized as unfair. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Paranto coordinated a memorial service for the Belanger family with the assistance of other Mattei elders. They contacted Matteis organizations around Saskatchewan to raise awareness of the planned ceremony and looked through genealogy records to find live descendants of the family. On a chilly November morning, precisely 135 years after the Bell and family were murdered, the memorial service was held. Members of the Mattei community, local historians, and officials from indigenous rights organizations were among the more than 50 participants. The ritual featured customary prayers, hymns, and offerings, and was performed in both English and Mishi. Mr. Paranto and the other elders expressed their formal grief for the Bell family's loss and lamented the unfairness of their deaths throughout the ceremony. They sanctified the ground where the family had lived and passed away in accordance with Mattei custom. Additionally, they requested that the spirits accept the prayers of the community and find serenity in the afterlife. Immediately following the ceremony, the Catlin house's paranormal activity ceased. The family stated that the children's bedrooms were free of frightening apparitions, inexplicable voices, and objects being flung. My equipment's ability to detect electromagnetic disturbances vanished entirely. However, the case had a significant influence that went much beyond just one haunting being solved. Wider scholarly inquiry on unrecorded crimes against Mattei families during the 1885 revolt was prompted by Dr. Dubois' studies of the Belange family killings. Growing awareness of the genocide against Indigenous peoples in Canada was aided by the discovery of several additional incidents of unrecorded killings in government and military archives. Although the Catlin family chose to stay in their home, they collaborated with the Mattei community to erect a memorial plaque in the Bellinger family's honor. In order to preserve the heritage of families like the Bellingers, they also set up a modest scholarship fund to aid Métis students pursuing studies in Canada. Personally, the investigation altered my perspective to historical property paranormal investigations. I discovered that unresolved historical trauma is typically the fundamental cause of supernatural phenomena, and that historical investigation, community involvement, and restorative justice, rather than conventional exorcism or cleaning rituals, are often the most effective ways to deal with hauntings. The Kalin family had not been the target of malevolent spirits from the Bellinger family. They required their narrative to be shared and their deaths to be remembered, since they had been the victims of historical injustice. They were able to discover the peace that had been denied to them for almost a century once the community recognized their suffering and paid tribute to their memory. I learned from the case that there is frequently less distinction between historical and paranormal research than we think. The echoes of actual people who experienced actual injustices are often the ghosts that haunt our architecture. And in order to assist them in finding peace, we must face up to difficult realities about our common past. The Kalin house is no longer disturbed by paranormal activity and now rests quietly amid the Saskatchewan grassland. But the memorial plaque in the front yard ensures that visitors remember the Métis family who lived and died there, and whose tale may have been lost forever if not for their frantic attempts to make their voices heard from beyond the dead. The story further strengthened my conviction that historical accuracy and human decency are at the heart of paranormal research. We frequently find stories of people who have been neglected, ignored, or purposefully removed from official historical records when we look into claims of supernatural activity. As investigators, we have a need to preserve and honor the human stories that underlie unexplained phenomena in addition to documenting them. Now at rest are the souls of François and Marie-Claire Belange, their kids, and François' parents. However, their narrative serves as a reminder that historical injustice and brutality can reverberate for generations until they are eventually addressed by truth and recognition. By assisting them in finding peace, we also assist ourselves in realizing the intricacy of our common past and our continued obligation to respect the memory of our ancestors. I am Coastal British Columbia's Search and Rescue Coordinator, and my name is Jalen Blackfeather. During my 15 years of organizing rescue operations in some of Canada's most hazardous terrain, everything that transpired in our hamlet of Alert Bay over the course of 3 months in 2021 violated every procedure and justification we had established. Over the course of 12 weeks, 7 members of our isolated island community vanished. They were all seasoned outdoor enthusiasts who were intimately familiar with the landscape. There were no bodies discovered. There was no rational explanation. Witnesses, however, claimed to have seen the missing in unlikely places. About 280 kilometers northwest of Vancouver, Alert Bay is located on Corin Island and is only reachable by ferry or small plane. The majority of the community's 500-plus residents are Namas First Nation members, while some non-Indigenous families have been residing there for many years. It is the type of town where everyone knows one another, where people watch out for one another, and where the loss of even one person causes the entire community to tremble. Thomas Matili, a 53-year-old fishing guide who was born and bred on the island, vanished in early June 2021, marking the start of the vanishings. In his sleep, Thomas was able to explore the waters surrounding Alert Bay, knowing every route, beach, and secret cove within a 50-kilometer radius. On June 7th, he was supposed to accompany a group of tourists whale viewing, but he never made it back to the harbor that night. The hunt for Thomas started right away. To cover every potential location where he might have run into problems, we sent out boats, helicopters, and ground crews. We were unable to link his disappearance to hazardous circumstances because the weather had been ideal that day, with clear skies and quiet seas. The next morning, his boat was discovered anchored in a protected bay around 10 kilometers south of Alert Bay. There was no damage to the boat. All of Thomas's safety gear was still on board, and the engine was operating flawlessly. The odd thing about discovering the boat was that Thomas was not the kind to desert his ship and swim to land. Having over 20 years of experience as a guide, he placed a high premium on safety. He would have radioed for assistance, or at the very least, given some clue of his destination, even if he had run into an incident on land. Over the course of 8 days, we combed hundreds of square kilometers of woodland, beach, and water in search of Thomas. We deployed expert teams equipped with underwater search tools and cadaver dogs. Despite the use of infrared scanning technology and helicopter backup from the Canadian military, we were unable to locate Thomas Matili. 3 weeks later, on June 29th, the second disappearance took place. A regular patrol of the ecological reserve on the island's north end was interrupted by the disappearance of Sarah Hunt, a 31-year-old park ranger employed by BC Parks. As a seasoned hiker and backcountry expert, Sarah always had emergency supplies, satellite communication devices, and GPS gear with her when she went into the wilderness. Sarah, like Thomas, just disappeared, leaving no sign of her whereabouts. The next morning, her backpack was discovered resting on a fallen log next to one of the main routes, but Sarah was not there. Her radio, her GPS gadget, and her emergency beacon were all still in the pack, and none of them had been turned on. It was especially concerning when Sarah's abandoned backpack was found, because it implied that whatever had happened to her had happened quickly, leaving her with no time to contact for assistance or even grab her emergency supplies. However, there was no indication that she had been hurt or fell, no sign of struggle, and no sign of an animal attack. The community was starting to get very worried by this time. Within 3 weeks of one another, 2 seasoned outdoor enthusiasts had disappeared under the same conditions. Although the RCMP had launched an inquiry, they shared our confusion. No suspicious people were nearby, there was no indication of foul play, and there was no rational explanation for how 2 people could just vanish in such a tiny, heavily trafficked location. On July 15th, the third disappearance took place. About 15 kilometers east of Alert Bay, 47-year-old logger Michael Dennis vanished while performing a timber survey on the mainland. Dennis had been employed in the coastal forest for more than 25 years. Michael was not there when his coworkers discovered his surveying tools neatly stacked on a tree stump. The fact that Michael's coworkers claimed to have seen him just minutes before they found his abandoned equipment added to the unease surrounding his absence. They said that Michael had been working in an area of forest that was entirely encircled by fallen logs and dense underbrush. His co-workers had been keeping an eye on the area's short passageway, which was the sole entry or exit. Or yet Michael had somehow disappeared from a place that should have been difficult to avoid. On August 2nd, the fourth disappearance took place. While caying close to Malcolm Island, Lisa Paul, a 28-year-old marine researcher who was studying orca populations, vanished. Lisa had 3 years of experience working in the seas surrounding Alert Bay and was a skilled kayaker. She was more familiar with weather patterns, tides, and currents than most commercial fishermen. The next morning, Lisa's kayak was discovered drifting empty in Blackfish Sound. Similar to the earlier disappearances, there was no indication of an emergency or accident. Her research, equipment, and emergency supplies were still in the kayak, as was her personal flotation device. The weather had been calm all day when she vanished, and the kayak had no visible damage. By August, it was hard to overlook the pattern. Over the period of 2 months, 4 competent and experienced individuals had disappeared under essentially the same conditions. All of the disappearances had taken place in places that the missing people were familiar with, during the day, and in favorable weather. Their equipment was discovered unharmed in each instance, indicating that they either intentionally left it behind or were taken from the scene so fast that they didn't have time to collect their possessions. Additional detectives from Vancouver were sent in by the RCMP, including criminal profilers and experts in missing persons cases. A command center was set up in Alert Bay, and all those who had interacted with the missing were interviewed in depth. However, the inquiry yielded no fresh information or insights. On August 20th, the 5th disappearance took place. While trekking alone on one of the island's interior routes, David Wilson, a 62-year-old retired teacher who had relocated to Alert Bay 5 years prior, vanished. Walking, David has visited almost every accessible part of Cormorant Island several times. He constantly kept his neighbors updated on his trekking plans and anticipated return time, demonstrating his methodical and careful nature. David was nowhere to be seen, but his walking stick was discovered leaning against a big cedar tree next to the main trail. After 4 days of searching, search teams were unable to locate any tracks, disturbed vegetation, or any clues as to David's possible whereabouts. On September 8th, the sixth disappearance took place. About 2 kilometers from the village center, in a well-known region, 35-year-old Jennifer Martinez, a nurse at the local health facility, vanished while collecting berries. Jennifer had been gathering berries in the same spot each summer for more than 10 years, so she was familiar with the area. Under a stand of salmonberry bushes, Jennifer's berry bucket was discovered, still half full of the berries she had been harvesting. However, Jennifer had disappeared just as thoroughly as the others. The location of the fruit bucket was especially odd, since it implied that Jennifer had been gathering berries when she vanished. But somehow, she had disappeared without moving the pail or leaking its contents. On September 26th, the 7th and last disappearance took place. A 44-year-old Namgis First Nation member and commercial fisherman named Robert Charlie vanished while inspecting his crab traps close to Hansen Island. Having fished the local waters since he was a little boy, Robert was among the most seasoned fishermen in the area. The radio was on, and the motor of Robert's fishing boat was still running when it was discovered, anchored close to his trap lines. Robert was not there, but one of his crab traps had been lifted up and was resting on the boat's deck. There was no sign of what would have caused Robert to abandon his boat while it was still in motion, and the trap was empty. The community had fallen into a panic by this time. We were no closer to knowing what was going on than we had been following the first disappearance, and 7 people had disappeared in less than 4 months. Theories included human trafficking rings, serial killers, and even unidentified natural phenomenon. However, tales that were much more unsettling than the actual disappearances started to come in early October. Sarah Hunt was spotted strolling along the seashore close to Ecological Reserve. According to her sister Elizabeth Hunt, Elizabeth said Sarah appeared healthy and typical. However, Sarah did not react or even notice Elizabeth's presence when she called out to her. For a few minutes, Elizabeth followed Sarah, but she lost sight of her as she turned a corner in the beach. Despite the fact that she couldn't have gone anywhere without Elizabeth noticing, Margaret Dennis reported seeing her brother Michael operating in a woodland area close to his regular logging location 2 days later. Margaret drove to the place to speak with Michael, but when she got there, nobody was there, and there was no sign that anyone had been working nearby lately. Other people of the community reported similar encounters over the next few weeks. While working on his yacht in the harbor, Thomas Matilpe was nowhere to be seen, and when people got to the pier, the boat was deserted. When other boers went to look into Lisa Paul's kayaking near Malcolm Island, they discovered nothing but empty water. Every sighting was short and terminated in the same manner. The absent person would appear to be going about their daily business for a few minutes, but they would never answer to anyone who attempted to contact them, and they would always disappear before anyone could approach them closely enough to touch them. As the reports grew increasingly specific, the RCMP started to take the sightings seriously after originally dismissing them as wishful thinking or psychological reactions to stress and suffering. Some of the sightings had taken place in locations that the witnesses could not have known the missing persons had visited, and multiple witnesses were reporting comparable behaviors and locations. I decided to plan one last thorough search in November, concentrating on the places where the missing people had been reported missing rather than where their possessions had been located. The whole community would be included in the search, including elders from the indigenous population who might not have access to traditional information about the island from traditional sources. At 93, Elder Mary Wilson, who had spent her whole life on Cormorant Island, gave us knowledge that fundamentally altered our perception of what might be taking place. There were sites on the island where the Namis people had long held spiritual significance, where the line between the spirit and physical worlds was thought to be thin, according to Elder Wilson. According to traditional legends, Elder Wilson informed me that people could occasionally find themselves in a state where they were neither totally alive nor entirely dead at these places. Though they would be unable to interact with the living or resume their regular lives, these individuals would nonetheless show up in locations that had held significance in their lives. She clarified that such events were uncommon and often only occurred during periods of intense spiritual upheaval or when the island's natural equilibrium had been upset. Elder Wilson proposed that people may have become caught between realms as a result of the recent surge in development and tourism upsetting historic spiritual locations. Following Elder Wilson's advice, we concentrated our last search on a number of caverns and underground passageways near the island's north end that the Namis people had revered. Because they were hard to get to and not places where missing people would often be anticipated to travel, search teams had never properly investigated these areas. After 3 days of meticulous searching, we finally located them on November 15th. The 7 individuals who went missing were found in a sizable subterranean room that was only accessible by a tight passageway that required them to crawl through solid rock for almost 50 meters. With a towering ceiling and smooth stone walls that appeared to glow with an inner light, the chamber itself was huge and most likely the result of water erosion over thousands of years. Sitting in a circle in the middle of the room, facing one another, the 7 missing people were motionless and silent. We tried to talk to them, but they were totally unresponsive, even though their eyes were open and their respiration seemed regular. They showed no evidence of damage, starvation, or weather exposure, and they seemed just as they did when they vanished. The most astonishing thing was that they had no recollection of the period they had been absent. They were bewildered and disoriented when we eventually succeeded in bringing them out of the chamber and back to the surface. But they thought that it had only been a few minutes since they had been going about their regular business. Thomas believed he was still a tour guide. The others had similar memories of their final moments of consciousness, and Sarah thought she was still on patrol. All 7 appeared to be in excellent health, showing no symptoms of going months without food, water, or medical attention, according to medical examinations. They had clean, undamaged clothing and showed no signs of long-term exposure to subterranean conditions. All 7, however, claimed to have experienced vivid dreams while in the chamber. They talked about common conceptions of the island's past, including things that had happened centuries before European settlers arrived. They had seen spiritual ceremonies, learned about customs that had been forgotten for generations, and experienced the viewpoint of Namis ancestors. Elder Wilson clarified that rather than being imprisoned, the missing individuals' time in the chamber had been a kind of spiritual education, and that they had been selected to act as guardians of traditional wisdom. Their return to the community, in her opinion, was an indication that the Namis people's cultural wisdom was ready to be shared, as they had been trained to conserve and disseminate it. In addition to returning to their regular lives, the 7 people have grown to be significant cultural assets for the Namis people. The community has benefited from their collective knowledge in understanding historical events, recovering ancient customs, and fortifying their ties to the spiritual elements of their ancestral land. The Namis nation has sealed the underground room and declared it a sacred sanctuary. After the 7 were brought back to the surface, the disappearances ceased entirely, indicating that whatever spiritual process had been occurring was now over. I discovered as a search and rescue coordinator that certain puzzles are intractable, using traditional techniques or scientific investigation. The jail in Valley Vanishings taught me that some missing person cases require traditional knowledge and cultural understanding rather than modern technology and investigative techniques, and that the line separating the material and spiritual worlds is not as clear as I had always thought. Additionally, the experience reaffirmed how crucial it is to collaborate with indigenous groups and honor their traditional wisdom when doing search and rescue missions on their native lands. Certain issues can only be resolved by comprehending the strong cultural and spiritual ties that exist between people and their homeland. Alert Bay is still a tranquil and secure neighborhood today, But for all of us who witnessed them, the events of 22 and 21 have had a profound effect. We now have a greater understanding of the mysteries that still surround us. Additionally, we have learnt to approach the unknown with respect and humility, rather than with disbelief and contempt. Music. The case that terminated my career as a former RCMP sergeant involved a series of killings at a wayside hotel that revealed a plot involving the highest echelons of our small city's government. I believed I had witnessed every type of crime and corruption imaginable after 32 years of police employment throughout Alberta. However, what I learned while looking into the deaths at Medicine Hat's Desert Rose Motel exposed a web of criminal activity so vast and ingrained in the political system of our community that it ultimately cost me my pension, my job, and my trust in the legal system I had dedicated my life to. Located roughly 300 kilometers southeast of Calgary in the center of southeastern Alberta, Medicine Hat has long been a resource-based community. For more than a century, the local economy has been fueled by natural gas, oil, and agriculture, which has resulted in a small but affluent elite controlling the majority of the important commercial and political activity in the area. With a population of roughly 60,000, the city is both big enough to have actual political clout, yet small enough that those in positions of authority are acquainted with one another. Situated just outside the city limits on the Trans-Canada Highway, the Desert Rose Motel served temporary workers who came to the region for building projects, seasonal agricultural labor, and oil field jobs. Although tourists and business visitors would not choose to remain there, it was a useful site for those at the bottom of the economic scale who required inexpensive short-term housing. On March 8, 2019, the motel's housekeeping crew found the first body. Marcus Thompson, a 34-year-old Nova Scotian who had traveled to Alberta in search of employment in the oil sector, was confirmed as the victim. While seeking for work at other drilling companies in the area, he had been lodging at the Desert Rose for 3 weeks. Without any indications of violence or struggle, Marcus was discovered dead in his chamber, lying fully clothed on his bed. The attending coroner's initial evaluation indicated that he had passed away naturally, most likely from a drug overdose or heart attack. However, the autopsy found no underlying medical issues that could have contributed to his death, and the toxicology findings, which were obtained 2 weeks later, showed no signs of drugs or alcohol in his system. Something about the case disturbed me, even though it was filed away and classed as death by unknown reasons. There was no reason why Marcus, a healthy guy in his 30s with no medical history, would have passed away unexpectedly while sleeping. I made the decision to look into his past and his behavior in the days before his death in greater detail. While waiting for a permanent job to become available, Marcus had been working odd jobs around town, I found out. He has worked for a number of temporary labor companies, performing general maintenance, loading warehouses, and building work for different local companies. My interviewees told me that Marcus had been hopeful about his future and had been preparing to move to Alberta with his wife and kids after he secured a stable job. However, it was also revealed to me that Marcus had been inquiring about certain work locations to which he had been assigned. His Desert Rose roommate said Marcus had told him about seeing creatures at building sites that didn't seem real. He had seen items that did not adhere to the formal project specifications being delivered to construction sites. And he had observed that some of the work being done did not match the building permits that should have been in the city's records. Marcus had been especially worried about a massive building project on Medicine Hat's north side, where federal funds were to be used to build a new community center. Marcus's roommate claimed that some of the materials being utilized were industrial-grade equipment that didn't appear appropriate for the project, and that the foundation work being done at the site was far more extensive than what would be required for a community center. 6 weeks later, on April 19th, the second fatality took place. Jennifer Walsh, a 28-year-old Manitoban who had been employed as a maid for multiple nearby companies, was the victim. Similar to Marcus, she was discovered dead in her Desert Rose motel room with no obvious reason for passing away. The autopsy results for Jennifer and Marcus were the same. No alcohol or drugs, no underlying medical issues, and no indications of trauma or violence. However, when I spoke with those who had known Jennifer, I found out that she had also been inquiring about anomalies she had noticed in her job. Jennifer had worked for a cleaning company that maintained the cleanliness of several city government structures, including the municipal offices, City Hall. Jennifer had reported to her boss that she had discovered documents in recycling bins and garbage cans that indicated city officials were engaged in financial transactions that didn't seem to be official government business. Documents pertaining to federal infrastructure funds intended for initiatives for the area's indigenous people had piqued Jennifer's curiosity. She discovered communications indicating that a portion of this financing was being redirected to initiatives that would largely benefit non-native entrepreneurs and developers. On May 27th, the third fatality took place. In the same enigmatic circumstances as the earlier deaths, 41-year-old British Columbian electrician Robert Hayes was discovered dead in his room. Around Medicine Hat, Robert had been assisting with electrical installations for different building projects. He'd also started asking inquiries about weird stuff he'd seen, just like the others. By this time, I was certain that the deaths were not natural and were related. It was no accident that 3 healthy adults died in the same place over the course of 3 months under the same conditions. I stepped up my investigation, concentrating on what the victims might have learned that would have made them potential murder targets. I formally requested permission from my managers to treat the deaths as possible homicides and to broaden the scope of the investigation to include the government contracts and construction projects the victims had been doubting, but my request was turned down. I was informed that the inquiry was a waste of money and that there was no proof of foul play. On June 15th, the 4th fatality took place. The body of Patricia Morris, a 53-year-old Saskatchewanian bookkeeper, was discovered in her Desert Rose room. Patricia had been assisting local firms with their financial record preparation for audits and tax filings while on temporary assignments. During my interviews with Patricia's co-workers, I found out that she had found serious irregularities in the financial records of multiple businesses that had contracts with the government. Patricia had informed her boss that she thought some of these businesses were defrauding the government by exaggerating their expenses and charging for work that was never done. More importantly, Patricia had noticed a pattern that implied a number of ostensibly separate businesses were in fact owned by the same group of investors who were coordinating their bids to guarantee that members of their network were given government contracts at exorbitant prices. I formally requested once more that the probe be expanded, this time to incorporate Patricia's financial fraud discoveries. My plea was turned down once more, and I was informed that I might face disciplinary action if I persisted in pursuing baseless conspiracy ideas. On July 9th, the 5th death took place. Similar to the earlier fatalities, 62-year-old Ontario accountant William Chen was discovered dead in his chamber. William had discovered significant inconsistencies in the distribution and use of government cash while examining financial records for a federal audit of infrastructure expenditures in the Medicine Hat region. I became aware that my own department was compromised at this point. The death trend was clear. The link to corruption in the government was obvious. Nevertheless, my managers were purposefully keeping me from looking into it. I started to suspect that the plot being covered up involved members of the RCMP leadership in Medical Hat. I made the decision to use my own resources and work during my off-duty hours to carry out my own inquiry outside of the established channels. I started to compile information regarding the government contracts, building projects, and financial transactions the victims had been looking into. What I found was a huge fraud operation involving federal infrastructure funds that were meant to be used for projects that would help Southern Alberta's Indigenous communities. Millions of dollars in federal funds had been misappropriated over a number of years to projects that largely benefited a network of local politicians, construction firms, and non-Indigenous developers. In order to apply for federal funds for community projects like housing, schools, and community centers, the program established fictitious Indigenous development firms. The projects would be subcontracted to businesses owned by the same individuals who controlled the fictitious Indigenous enterprises. After the funding was granted, the extra money would then be transferred to personal accounts, and the projects would be finished with inferior supplies and techniques. Some projects were never finished at all, and the money just vanished into offshore accounts and sham corporations. In other instances, initiatives that were meant to help Native communities were instead constructed in non-Native regions and utilized for commercial development, which brought in money for the conspirators. The mayor, 2 city councilors, the city manager, and the police chief were among the top Medicine Hat business figures who were involved in the conspiracy. It also included a number of policemen from my own detachment who had been assigned to look into complaints regarding the fraudulent projects but had done so in a methodical manner. August 3rd was the date of the 6th death. A 47-year-old Saukha First Nation member named David Blackhorse was discovered dead in his Desert Rose room. David had been assisting in the supervision of the federal infrastructure projects that were being scammed by the conspiracy, serving as a link between government agencies and indigenous tribes. David had been working on a thorough report on the missing infrastructure financing that would have revealed the entire scam. Therefore, his passing was very noteworthy. David had been planning to disclose his findings to federal authorities, according to his co-workers, and he had recorded evidence of the fraud going back more than 5 years. I was aware that I was running out of time and that David's death was not natural. The conspirators would not think twice about killing a police officer who threatened to expose them if they were prepared to kill 6 individuals in order to safeguard their plan. I sent a thorough report outlining the link between the fatalities at the Desert Rose Motel and the infrastructure financing fraud, together with copies of all the evidence I had collected, to the RCMP headquarters in Ottawa. Additionally, I forwarded copies to a number of journalists and Indigenous rights groups who had been pushing for government spending accountability. I was summoned to a conference with my district commander 3 days after I turned in my report, and I was told that I would be placed on leave while an internal inquiry into the claims of misbehavior was conducted. The suspension essentially stopped me from carrying out my research or using any government resources. On August 28th, the 7th and last fatality took place. Journalist Maria Santos, 39, of Calgary, was discovered dead in her Desert Rose room. Based on the information I gave her, Maria had been looking into the infrastructure funding scam and writing a number of pieces that would have brought the plot to the public's attention. Finally, people outside of the Medicine Hat region took notice of Maria's passing. Her publication urged a thorough probe into what they described as the systematic killing of those looking into government corruption by contacting the RCMP headquarters in Ottawa. The case was taken over by a special investigating team dispatched from Ottawa. The mayor of Medicine Hat, the police chief, 3 city councilors, the city manager, and 12 other conspirators were all taken into custody in less than 2 weeks. For me personally, the arrests came too late, but the inquiry showed that the fraud operation had stolen more than $40 million in government funding over 8 years. The internal inquiry into my actions had been skewed to seem that I had been exchanging private information with unapproved parties and carrying out illegal inquiries. Even though the special investigation team later acknowledged that all of my discoveries had been correct and that my actions had been crucial in uncovering the conspiracy, I was nevertheless forced to leave the RCMP and lost my pension. All of the key players were found guilty after the conspirators' trial, which started in 2021. The mayor received a 12-year federal prison sentence. The others were sentenced to 3 to 8 years, while the police chief was given 10 years. New oversight protocols were put in place to stop similar frauds in the future, and the federal government created a compensation fund for the duped Indigenous communities. However, 7 people had lost their lives to defend a conspiracy that was eventually discovered. Furthermore, homicide charges were never brought against those who killed them. Although the special investigation team concluded that all 7 victims were killed by an undetectable poison supplied through their food or water, the official cause of death for each of them is still recorded as unknown. Even though the Desert Rose Motel was demolished in 2022, I occasionally pass by the deserted lot and think about people like Maria Santos, David Blackhorse, Patricia Morris, Robert Hayes, Jennifer Walsh, Marcus Thompson, and William Chen. They should be regarded as heroes rather than victims, because they were regular people who died for the guts to speak up against injustice and corruption. I learned from the case that corruption can occur at all levels of government and law enforcement, and that those tasked with safeguarding the public are occasionally the same individuals who are abusing and damaging marginalized populations. It also taught me that there's always a price for speaking truth to power, but that the price for keeping quiet can be even worse. I currently work part-time as a security guard and live on a meager pension, but I have no regrets about the decisions I made. Justice was finally served for the 7 victims of the Desert Rose Motel scam, and the duped indigenous communities were compensated for their losses. Even when doing the right thing comes at a bigger personal cost than anyone should have to bear, there are occasions when that must be sufficient. One of the biggest corruption cases in Canadian history was the Medicine Hat infrastructure fraud case. However, it also showed that when common people speak up against injustice, even the most potent plots may be foiled. The Desert Rose Motel victims' bravery in pursuing the truth ultimately resulted in justice for the communities that had been taken advantage of and damaged by those who were meant to serve and protect them.